Hey guys, Max here, and yesterday was Monday the 21st. The markets opened back up after the weekend, and by and large, equities fell, but not by a huge margin. This does now break the streak of green days that we had running over the last week, but that was all based on nonsense from the Federal Reserve and overly optimistic investors hoping for an end to the war in Ukraine, which isn't really rational right now. Today we'll cover what happened in the markets themselves, what Powell spoke about, and we're going to touch on Boeing as well, who just saw another one of their planes crash with many people dead in China. Of course, that's awful in and of itself, but this is a finance channel, so we're going to look at what has just happened with the company as well. So in the markets, what happened? Well, the S&P 500 fell 1% at times, but in the end of the day, it rose to lose just 0.04% by close. The Nasdaq did a little bit worse, dropping 0.4% by the end of the day, and its dip was down at 1.5%. The FTSE 100 in the UK was up 0.4%, and the Stock 600 across Europe was up 0.04%, inverse of what the S&P did. Now really, there were no major movements by the end of the day, but we did see some volatility throughout the day as Powell came out and he spoke about inflation and interest rate hikes that are due to come, and we will cover that in detail in a moment. By and large though, investors were pretty consistent and tame for once. There were no hugely emotive news stories from Ukraine coming out, nothing like Putin threatening nuclear war, for example. There was some bad news which was mostly ignored, and it's the fact that oil prices are rising once more. WTI crude oil is now sitting at $113 a barrel, and Brent crude oil is sitting at $115 a barrel. I guess it's just time to say goodbye to low oil prices, guys. It's not coming at 4 months now. Now, we did, of course, see the markets panic on the Ukraine war when Russia actually invaded, and that caused a spike in oil prices. But then we saw a pullback as investors and markets really started to consider the long-term impacts on supply and demand, and as a result, prices are now rising once more. The old adage comes to mind here: markets are a voting machine in the short term and a weighing machine in the long term. Every day further from the invasion of Ukraine, oil prices are going to become more rational and less based on the emotion of traders and that feeling of what might happen next, and more rooted in reality. The fact that prices are rising while this is happening, while markets are becoming more rational, is very bad news for oil prices in the future, and it's bad for inflation as well. Now, gold prices, on the other hand, didn't move much at all. They're still holding at around about $1,935 an ounce. Bonds saw a sell-off as investors worried about the hawkish Fed after Powell's speech. The US 10-year Treasury yield rose 14 basis points to 2.29%, a very high number compared to the last 3 years really, far higher than anything since before COVID took off. In real terms though, that's still a deeply negative return. Now, the fear for this isn't actually the yield itself, it's how quickly the bond yields are moving. 14 basis points in a day is not a small amount, and we're seeing these big moves quite often these days. Lots of people, of course, are constantly looking to the bond markets to try and gauge the risk of recession and what we might see for the future of our economies, and this volatility is bad news. And now finally, what's going on in the world of crypto? Well, we saw small but consistent gains over the weekend. Bitcoin and Ethereum were up about 3%-ish, now sitting at $42,000 and $3,000 each. Altcoins saw slightly larger gains on average. There were some outliers though. Most of them are up somewhere between 2 and 5%. Luna and AVAX though are both down 3 and 2% each. Now, the first big bit of important news for the day was Powell coming out and talking about his decisions and what he's going to do in the future. He said that inflation is very bad, and it looks like we have a genius over here, and that curbing it is a top priority for 2022. He also said he's ready to back a 0.5% interest rate hike if necessary in May. The Federal Reserve last week signaled 6 more rate hikes at 0.25%, which would leave us with interest rates just below 2% by the end of 2022. Now, the markets were a little bit unhappy with this at first. They dropped about 1% on the news straight away, but the markets then rose back to where they started for the day because investors actually considered what was said and decided that the risk from Powell is not too great. Now, some banks and institutions are reading lots more into Powell's remarks. Goldman Sachs, for example, now predicts the next 2 months will both see 0.5% interest rate hikes, which is far more hawkish than they had previously anticipated. Now, this is a big change for Powell, especially compared to last week where he was very dovish regarding monetary policy, so why the sudden change? Well, there are a couple possibilities here. The first is that oil prices were falling last week, but they're not anymore. Of course, they saw that spike as Ukraine was invaded up to around $130 a barrel, which was terrifying. But then oil prices started declining, and at the point of Powell's last speaking, oil was sitting at around $100 a barrel and still falling, so it was possible that Powell was hoping it would continue to fall, and that would ease inflation and he wouldn't have to raise rates by 0.5% a month. In the week that followed that though, prices started to rise again and oil right now is above $110 a barrel each. If that was his idea, then it didn't go too well for him and he's still going to have to hike rates hard to curb inflation. Now, the other option of what's going on and what I personally believe is most likely to be the case is that Powell, of course, just doesn't care about inflation. He's just trying to hold the markets together with the perfect amount of hawkish talk and dovish action. Yesterday, he said that he will act if it's necessary to curb inflation, but it's been necessary for him to act for a minimum of 6 months now, and yet he delayed and he delayed and he delayed. Finally, he acted, but if he really wanted to curb inflation like he claimed he would have hiked rates by 0.5% at least last week, but he didn't. He hiked by the bare minimum. It is clear, in my opinion, that he's simply lying to us. His actions and words do not align at all. That is the simple truth. It isn't an opinion. His rhetoric and his actions do not make sense when taken together. We also need to remember that real interest rates today are lower than they were a month ago because inflation is rising quicker than interest rates are, which is utterly absurd. Now, Powell also managed to convince markets that he is still going to curb inflation while not damaging asset prices with his rhetoric yesterday, which is, as I've said multiple times on the channel, his main mandate. The markets didn't really move up or down. He achieved his aim perfectly of maintaining asset prices. The problem is, this failure to act now only increases problems for the US economy in the future. With each point of inflation, recession risks grow, consumer income dries up, and discretionary spending disappears as well. Powell, though, is a short-term guy. All he cares about is getting through the next few months without too much criticism. When push comes to shove, he will simply retire and walk away from everything with his own wealth intact. We saw his unwillingness to act for the good of the economy at the end of 2018 when he panicked after raising rates and markets dropped, and so he dropped rates back down to 0%, and then we saw him drag his feet at every opportunity. When someone fails at their job consistently for 4 years in a row, they lose their credibility, and that's simply what we see here. Someone who has failed and is no longer trusted by anyone with an ounce of sense. All I can really say is just to stop believing what he says, stop putting your money into the markets based on the words out of his mouth, because it's the same mouth that screamed at us to ignore inflation because it's transitory, all the while he continued printing money. Instead, we should watch his actions, watch how he continued to print that money, buy up bonds and inflate asset prices for months as inflation soared and unemployment had already cratered. Watch how every month he tells us that he's willing to make the hard decisions, but then he never actually does that. He always simply kicks the can down the road. Just stop trusting this awful man in general. He's useless, less than useless even. He's spineless, and we shouldn't give his opinion any credence anymore. Now, with that rant about the Fed and Powell as usual over, what's going on with Boeing? Well, a China Eastern Airlines aircraft nosedived out of nowhere and crashed, and all 132 people on board were killed. Now, that is absolutely awful and horrific. It's really unfortunate, but it was a Boeing 737-800. Now, Boeing has had some turmoil in recent years with far too many of their planes crashing really, and it's hurting the company because it seems like it's due to poor quality control or negligence on behalf of Boeing. Obviously, we are way too early days to say what the problem here was, but the crash is very unusual by all accounts, and with Boeing's ongoing controversies, many people and investors are automatically assuming that Boeing is at fault, which there's a fair probability is the reality, we just aren't sure yet. Now, it is worth noting that this is not the same plane as the 737 MAX, which is the one that's crashed too much. This is the 737-800. Now, I'd love to tell you the difference between the two planes, but I don't know planes, I don't know the difference. But all the experts in the industry are making this distinction that while the naming is similar, the plane is actually very different, and it has a really strong safety record. Nonetheless, the entire 737-800 fleet in China has been grounded, and the Chinese are pretty furious towards Boeing here. Boeing's share price has been hit by this. It fell about 8% on this news straight away, but then it rose back up about 5% as we learn more about the crash. Now, this is a lot of volatility, but to be honest, that is expected. Investors don't know any more than we do, and this is a very difficult thing to price in. If it's the plane's fault, then this is awful for Boeing. If it's a pilot's fault, then it isn't. So expect increased volatility for the stock as we continue to learn more about what happened. Finally, there will be an update on the situation in Ukraine coming out soon on the Stoic Politics channel with some quite major updates. More Russian generals have been killed, some pretty crazy casualty figures from the Russian side in general, pretty poor optics regarding Mariupol and the humanitarian corridor that Russia was supposedly allowing. They are now no longer even pretending to be setting one up, for example. Some hypersonic missiles being used as the conflict continues to escalate. I will, as usual, give an update on what the situation on the ground is like and then go into detail on some specific stories like that in Mariupol, so stay tuned for that and make sure to check out Stoic Politics. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure to like and comment and subscribe to bless the YouTube algorithm. If you want more content like this, then check out our Patreon and join our community of investors. You get access to our Discord, loads of exclusive content like insight into my portfolio and buy and sell alerts for all my own investments. There's a link in the description to masterworks.io, a site that allows you to buy fractional shares of art from world famous artists like Banksy, which can be a great way to diversify your portfolio with non-market correlated assets. It's completely free to sign up, so if that sounds interesting, then make sure to check it out. There's also a link in the description to BlockFi, which will give you up to $250 in free Bitcoin when you use it. You can also get 9% interest on stablecoins like USDC, which is a far higher rate than you get from any savings account these days. Just make sure not to use Tether. Thank you all for the support. Thanks for watching. Stay stoic. Until next time.